There were massive protests today in Kathmandu, right outside the Parliament building in Nepal. It was led by Gen Z youngsters who were out in huge numbers to defy the ban on social media platforms that was installed by the KPOL government in Nepal. These youngsters were aghast that some of the most popular youth platforms like Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, etc. were all being summarily banned by the Oli government in the name of upholding public morality. The police had to open fire. At least 19 protesters are said to be dead in the police firing. The toll could rise further. This shows yet again what a tinderbox India's neighborhood is turning out to be. We saw this in Bangladesh last year, the unprecedented protest that led to the ouster of the land's long-standing ruler there, Sheikh Hasina. She had to flee in exile to India. Earlier, we saw protests again in Sri Lanka, where young people took to the streets because of the economic crisis, because of runaway inflation, and now we're seeing this in Nepal. Is it time to probe if there is something larger, something bigger at play, if there is a conspiracy of sorts that is happening all around India's neighborhood in a bid to try and weaken India's periphery? And if there is, then who is at play here? Who is the one who is conspiring here to weaken India's neighborhood? But I want to first bring you up to speed with some of the defining moments of the protest today. I want to go across to our video wall. Gen Z Nepali protesters tried to enter the iconic Nepali Parliament building. They tried to storm the building amidst heavy security. You can see some parts of the building being set on fire too. Demonstrators gathered at the entrance of the Parliament complex. This was during a massive protest that was happening. There was a lot of issues. There's corruption, there is runaway inflation, joblessness, and of course the trigger was the government's decision to block several social media platforms, very popular ones including Instagram and WhatsApp. Then you have the unrest that was filmed. The police had to resort first to lathi charge, then tear gas, and eventually they had to fire at these individuals, fire at these Gen Z protesters, in which at least, and this is the latest count, it could go up further, at least 19 people are feared to be dead. This is in Kathmandu alone. Remember, there were protests in other cities as well. It was a step-by-step process. The police initially had to fire rubber bullets, then tear gas, and then eventually, once they saw that they were in no position to control the crowds, they had to fire live bullets against these young protesters. And as the protests spiraled out of hand, police fired water cannons, tear gas shells, and eventually live bullets in a bid to try and disperse the protesters. You can see the canisters being thrown around. You can see columns of police and rapid action personnel being deployed to try and gain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation on the ground. And all of this is happening outside the iconic Nepali Parliament building. This is the same place where more than 10, almost 15 years ago, there were mass protests against the monarchy. And now today, it's young people who are protesting against the KPOL government, against its diktat of a complete and outright ban on all social media platforms. I want to play out what the Prime Minister of Nepal said in a bid to try and assuage the feelings of these young protesters, but they would have none of it. So much so, look at the crowds, massive crowds, all the way leading up to the Parliament building. You can see malls, cinema halls, apartment buildings, all on the left of where these individuals are protesting. There's a bank, there's a hotel, there's a cinema complex, apartment buildings, and this entire road leading all the way up past this bridge to the Parliament complex was jam-packed with young protesters who were at a standoff with the police. Let's try and play what Prime Minister KPOL of Nepal said, and then we'll bring in a special guest as well and try and get a sense of what the ground situation is right now in Kathmandu.
हामी हुन त सीमानाको छलफल, सार्वभौम सत्ताको छलफल, स्वाधीनता र स्वतन्त्रताको छलफल गरिरहेका छौँ नि। मान्छे पहिले आफै स्वतन्त्र छैन, आफ्नै खोपडी स्वतन्त्र छैन, आफै चिन्तन स्वतन्त्र ढङ्गले चिन्तन गर्न सक्दैन भने अनि त्यसले स्वतन्त्रता कहाँबाट स्वतन्त्र ल्याउँछ? अलि घाक बुद्धिजीवीहरूको एउटा घाक पत्रिकामा आज एउटा इन्टरभ्यू देखाएको थिएँ मैले, भव्य तस्बिर समेत, व्यक्तित्ववाला तस्बिर समेत आएको थियो। मेसेज बुझ्न नसक्ने, मेसेन्जरमाथि नियन्त्रण गर्ने भन्ने तुकबन्दी कस्तो राम्रो छ।
So the social media ban is being seen as the latest flashpoint. There have been years of built-up anger against the KPOL government. Remember, this is not the first time that he's come to power. There is public anger against corruption. There's a degree of authoritarianism. There are poor health and education facilities meant for young people. And of course, social media is seen as some kind of a venting mechanism, a platform for young people to go out and vent their frustrations over the lack of governance in Nepal. But that young Nepalese allege their freedom of expression was suppressed, their freedom of speech was suppressed, and their right to expression was also suppressed by this outright ban, which they are calling unconstitutional. There's also growing frustration among young people over press freedoms being curtailed because of the passage of various restrictive bills that have happened in the last few months since Mr. Oli came back to power in the middle of last year. So a whole bunch of things, it was building up, and finally the government order banning these social media platforms because the government claims that they refuse to pay local taxes there. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the political cost of it is now being counted. I want to go across to this piece of breaking news that's just coming through. Nepal's Home Minister Ramesh Lekhak has resigned following the deadly protest that we saw today outside the Nepali Parliament building. It's rocked other cities across the country as well. In fact, Mr. Lekhak, who is the Home Minister, has cited moral responsibility for the loss of lives. At least 19 young people were shot today by the police as the police were grappling to try and get a handle on the situation. There were multiple angry demonstrations. Parts of the Parliament building were set fire to. The Home Minister announced his decision a short while ago, and that is escalating now the political fallout amidst the ongoing unrest. And even now, even in this night hour, it doesn't seem like the police have managed to get a handle on the situation there. The tense standoff is still continuing between young students and Gen Z protesters on the one side, and the government and the law enforcement agencies and personnel on the other, who are trying to, get a control on the situation. I want to go across to Ajay Bhadra Khanal. He's a research director with the Center for Social Innovation and Foreign Policy. Can you sort of bring us up to speed with this whole decision taken by the Oli government to ban social media? Why did they take that decision? Why was it announced all of a sudden? And then did they not anticipate? I mean, there were thousands of young students and Gen Z protesters who had showed up today outside the Parliament complex. Was this not anticipated?
Yes, I think I would like to start by saying that today was a very, very sad day. We are all heartbroken and angry. As you said, more than 19 students have been shot to death. More than 350 are still injured, and protests are still taking place. And it's something our generation has never seen before, not even in 1990, a movement for the restoration of multi-party democracy, not in the 2006 movement against autocratic monarchy. And as you said, this is basically the Gen Z movement against corruption and censorship. And the recent social media ban was just a trigger. But just before the ban, a social media wave was going viral in TikTok and elsewhere, exposing the lavish lifestyle of corrupt politicians and the children. And it was not just now, but it's in the recent 2-3 years. The politicians were very irritated by this constant criticism going on in the social media. And as you also said, in recent years, the government has been showing a very authoritarian tendency combined with widespread corruption and impunity. So that's the most important context. We've seen several bills that severely restrain freedom of expression and social organization. We've seen the executive capturing the judiciary and packing judges in the court. It's controlling the parliamentary committees. They have just become rubber stamps for the top leaders. And, they are persecuting opposition parties. So this context where, the government is very repressive and intolerant, especially given the context that the youth are, becoming more politicized and new political forces are emerging in recent years and in recent months. I think mainstream political parties see this as a threat, and basically the youth movement was seen as a threat by the Prime Minister KP Oli.
But tell me, Mr. Khanal, we have seen, such mass protests in Nepal in the past, the most famous being in 2005-6 against the monarchy, and the monarchy, the king was thrown out of power at that time and so on. Why should we believe that this time young people will actually be able to effect some kind of political change? Mr. Oli has been an old player. He's been Prime Minister multiple times in the past. He's been a wily political operative. If he were to climb back on the social media diktat that was passed, will these young protesters go away? Is that the only trigger point, as it were, for their protests? Or do they want to see Mr. Oli and the entire political class out of power, and do they want to establish some kind of a new politics in Nepal?
Things have changed. Today was a turning point. Before today, we could have said that maybe, the old political parties, Mr. KP Oli and Sher Bahadur Deuba, might stay in power. But things have changed from today. And this was just a movement led by the Gen Z, the others, widespread support for the Gen Z. It's massive support everywhere in all parts of Nepal, and I don't think these people are going to let this go. I think people will not rest until these two parties are blown over by the movement. And I don't think we have a regular election after 2 years, but I don't think people are going to wait for the next elections. Things might change before the next 2 years.
And I don't want to get into, conspiracy theories, but social media has a lot of theories floating around about how these are people who want to bring back the monarchy in some form, want to bring back some kind of utopian idea of a political system in Nepal, so on and so forth. There's also talk about some of these people being funded by certain foreign governments, so on and so forth. Is there any truth to any of that, or is that completely speculation at this point of time? This is completely, as you say, an organic protest where young people took grave offense to the fact that social media was being banned in some kind of an authoritarian diktat, and they just took to the streets organically.
Yeah, I think this is less relevant for today's event. This was a very spontaneous kind of event organized by the Gen Z, maybe inspired by things happening elsewhere in the world, but this was a very organic kind of spontaneous movement. Of course, there are multiple factions, some of them may be sponsored by, forces outside Nepal's border, external border. So on both sides, maybe, we have, on the one hand, we have these authoritarian tendencies coming from the north, and maybe, these religious identity movements coming from the south. But I think as far as today's event goes, this was less relevant. This was purely a spontaneous movement led by the Gen Z, and the people, sort of were very happy to see the Gen Z engage in politics.
And finally, how do you see this now playing itself out? What is the culmination of these protests?
I think it's something we have to wait and see, but the anger is genuine. It's very widespread. People are really saddened, heartbroken, but at the same time, they are really angry. And this has spread all over Nepal. In just one day, this has spread all over Nepal. And my hunch is that this is going to grow over the next few days or few weeks, and this is not going to go away like before. I think this is going to create some genuine change.
Okay, we'll see how that plays out. We've seen this in other parts of the world as well. We saw this in the Arab Spring. In some countries, it led to an overthrow of the government. In some others, long-standing dictators and long-standing establishments crushed those movements. But we'll see how it plays out in Nepal. For the moment, Ajay Badra Karnal, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective into what has been pretty dramatic and some would even say historic pictures emerging from Nepal today, where young people were incensed by the almost authoritarian and completely irrational ban that was imposed on social media platforms, very popular social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp, instituted by the KP Oli government. They felt it was completely uncalled for, it was draconian, it was authoritarian, and they had this protest march right in the heart of Kathmandu, all the way to the Parliament complex, and there things got ugly between law enforcement personnel and these young protesters. Things got violent, and at last count, at least 19 people had been shot dead in these police live firing that happened outside the Parliament complex. We'll keep an eye out on how that story plays out in Nepal and whether or not, as Mr. Khanal was saying, whether it will actually lead to some kind of a political change. We'll keep a close eye on developments emerging from Kathmandu.